Well, here we go. It's Friday of week number 2, day 10 of the semester, and we're getting ready to start talking about chapter 8, which deals with participation, more particularly political participation. And this chapter is going to talk a lot about voting, but we need to understand, and as you're reading the chapter, you need to pull out of there the fact that there are many other ways to get politically involved besides voting. Voting is just the most common way that we tend to think of political participation. So when reading the chapter, first thing that you need to take out of there is make sure you understand what we call and discuss the traditional types of political participation. Then, as we've talked in previous chapters, like the chapter on media, there are the more recent types of political participation. Many of those types of participation include digital media and social networking and things of that nature. So be familiar with how the digital participation has impacted political participation as a whole, and make sure you pull out of the chapter whether or not the author of your textbook believes that digital participation tends to lead to more direct political participation, like voting and things of that, or if digital participation tends to suppress those types of traditional political participation or not. Okay? Now, also understand the concept of suffrage. Make sure you understand what the term suffrage means. Make sure that you understand that there are different groups in this country that have fought for their rights of suffrage or their right to vote. And understand that this right to fight for your rights to vote have been going on since before we were a country. And we simply think a lot about African Americans gaining the right to vote and then women gaining the right to vote. But there are other things that have impacted whether different groups truly have suffrage or not. Your textbook's going to talk about the types of things that have limited voter turnout over the years. African Americans have had the right to vote since the end of the Civil War. But we really don't see African Americans voting in large numbers until very, very recent years. And make sure you understand what types of things have caused African Americans not to vote very much, and understand why they're tending to vote more and more today. Also, take a look at the different demographic groups that are addressed in this chapter. Things such as age, race, your level of religiosity, as we say, your socioeconomic status. Are you wealthy? Are you poor? Are you educated? Are you uneducated? All of those different demographic characteristics of people tend to impact how involved they are politically. And it tends to impact the level at which those groups vote. Now, also understand that different racial groups will vote at different rates. Over the years, we've seen more and more African Americans voting. We've seen a larger number of Hispanics voting. We see more and more Asians voting. All of these things impact the overall process of voting in this country. Now, also, make sure you realize that it's the states that create the laws by which people vote. The Constitution itself says absolutely nothing about who can vote and who can't vote. So as we remember from the chapter dealing with the Constitution, since the Constitution doesn't talk about voting, that becomes an issue that the states get to regulate. So when we talk about, groups that tend to vote more often than others, and other groups that tend to have their vote suppressed, a lot of that has to do with state voting laws. And as we know, each state has different sets of voting laws. So be familiar with how state voting laws, and in particular things like ballot initiatives and much more competitive elections at the state level. Make sure you realize that those things really impact the level of voter turnout. Okay? And then the last thing that you need to look at towards the end of the chapter are the different voting and registration methods that are used in different states. When we take a look at a lot of the research, one of the biggest impactors on whether or not a state has higher or lower voter turnout is the ease by which a person can register to vote. So the states that have more difficult registration processes tend to have lower voter turnout. The states who have easier voter registration processes tend to have greater voter turnout. We are seeing some trends in the country that we're allowing people to vote in different methods. The way it used to be, you used to have to show up at a voting location. Nowadays, they have different ways that you can vote in different states. Early voting, permanent absentee ballots, some of the things that are talked about in the textbook. Make sure you're familiar with those types of concepts. Okay? So make sure that you understand this chapter talks about political participation, mostly about voting, but make sure you pull out in there some of the discussions about other ways that people get politically involved. Now, as you know, this is the last chapter before we have exam number 2. Exam number 2 will open tomorrow, Saturday morning at 8 a.m., and it will close by midnight on Sunday. Make sure you give me a call if you have any questions at all about what's going on, because when I post the exam tomorrow sometime, I'm going to be on the road on my way back from Texas. So make sure if you have questions or concerns or problems while taking the exam, that you call me on my cell phone as soon as you have that problem. That way I don't have to worry about responding to an email, which is probably going to be several hours after you have the problem. So, have any problems? Give me a call on my cell phone. Otherwise, good luck, and I will talk to you again on Monday.